New Yorker. Oh, okay. I'm going to record the meeting if that's okay. So we had Jan Fang of the New Yorker with us last week, and she was talking about the kind of reporting she's done in situ, both on phone and via video and other things. And we're lucky to have Sam Dolnick today to talk about what he's been doing and what the New York Times has been doing. So maybe Sam, you could just tell us a little bit about what you do at the Times and how you are dealing with the current pandemic and reporting during the pandemic.
Yes, I will. And I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, everybody, for joining and for inviting me. So my job at the Times, I'm an assistant managing editor is the bureaucratic title, which means, part of the senior leadership of the newsroom, trying to kind of oversee the whole machine and figure out how to keep doing what we're doing and how to change and where we should evolve. My portfolio tends to be a lot of the newer stuff. So I oversee the audio report that we do and the film and television stuff that we do. We're doing a lot of documentaries now, and then working with our whole digital experience, whether it's our new live journalism or more visual journalism, and all of the kind of new ways that you can tell stories. I'm trying to work across all of those and figure out what's working, what's not working, what's connecting with audiences. And the pandemic, needless to say, has reshaped everything, so many things, how we work, and what we produce and how we produce it and the speed with which we produce it. I mean, this has more quickly reshaped the newsroom than anything I can remember in many ways that have been good, and a lot of ways that I think will stick and last. The crisis has been kind of an accelerant in a lot of ways. We have launched many new projects that in normal times would have probably taken months to gestate, but the urgency of the moment had us just kind of go, and we launched them more quickly. We've created new products and programs and services and forms of journalism that wouldn't have made sense in a previous era, but feel right now. And we're all just kind of like constantly experimenting and trying to figure out how can we do justice to this story of this magnitude, something that touches literally every corner of the world, every beat in the newsroom. And we have hundreds and hundreds of them, has been reshaped by this. Some made more urgent, some made absolutely less. How do you respond to each one and make them kind of match the moment? So it's this nonstop survey across all of that for us.
So I'd associated you with the Daily in particular. What are some of the other sort of forward-looking things that have been thrust upon you that you've been working on because of the crisis that you see perhaps as having legs in the future?
Yeah, well, to stick with audio for a minute, we've got an incredible team of journalists, the best in the world. I'm so impressed with them every day, who make the Daily, and they have been absolutely fired up. It's been a different coronavirus story every day for however many weeks now. But all these new angles and humanity and urgency and big picture and small picture, the Daily just continues to hum, and that audience is growing every day, bigger and bigger. But beyond that, the audio team realized people need more than just virus stories.
Right.
We need relief from that, and sometimes we need escape. So the audio team has been, in many ways, a news-focused team, but this has allowed us given us a reason an opportunity to go into other territories. So we're calling them these Friday episodes, Joy and Relief, a special episode every Friday. We did one about cooking, where a woman was cooking over Zoom with her grandmother and kind of reconnected with her family through recipes. And we did one around music, a music critic kind of telling the stories of 5 songs that he couldn't get out of his head. And we've done ones where we spoke to the author George Saunders and looking to him for wisdom. All of these different kinds of stories, which are not news stories, they're not the Daily by any means, but they are, we think, journalism that people want to consume right now. So so the crisis has given us a chance to push into other forms of audio in a way that's great. But beyond audio, we've got a travel section, we've got a food section, we've got a style section. With everyone trapped at home, all of it was starting to feel a little bit, A, crazy. You can't travel now. But B, also like not quite speaking to the moment. So one of our most creative editors, Sam Sifton, kind of on a dime, created this new section, this new hub called At Home, which is a combination of all of the guidance and report from cooking to crosswords to how to give yourself a haircut, all of the stuff that would never existed before, but is now relevant to everyone. So we created this whole new section, a whole new department that I think is really connecting with readers, but is going to last in some form even beyond the pandemic because it's become so useful. We've got data visualizations tracking the crisis. We've got live blogs. Our live blog has been on for however many days now, 60 some days, which has never ever happened before. And that kind of live experience is going to become part of how we cover the world from now on, I bet. And so I could keep going, but there's a whole bunch of things.
Just what newspaper reporters wanted is even more of an accelerant to this kind of extra real existence of That's perfect. I noticed I was reading yesterday that you are putting aside the print version anyway of the sports section and the travel section. I guess that's part of what you were just discussing right now.
Yeah, exactly. There are hard decisions to be made, but there aren't sports to cover in any meaningful way. So there's still fascinating questions around when are the leagues going to open? How are they thinking about it? There's lots of reporting to do, and we have great reporters still are targeted there. But we also have, we took a lot of those sports reporters and put them on the coronavirus beat. It's kind of all hands on deck. So the sports department has sent a lot of reporters to other desks. A books editor is now working on the science desk. It's been this whole kind of jumble as we've all tried to contribute to this report. But part of what shakes out there is, we should deliver an at-home section in print every weekend. And let's do that instead of the travel section. Let's move those resources. So it's kind of allowed us to stop and say, what speaks to this moment most effectively? And let's go after that instead of focusing on what we've always done in the past.
So let me say to everyone out there who is locked in listening, we're going to get to questions in about half an hour. So if you want to submit questions, do so through the chat function. And then Sam will look over them at that time and probably along the way and decide which ones he wants to answer and how he wants to answer them. One criticism I've made of not the Times specifically, but the media in general is that for quite some time, the pandemic was treated almost as a statistical story. First as a business story, because of the obvious economic implications of it, and then as sort of a numbers story, how many affected, how many dying, can we flatten the curve, those sorts of things. It wasn't really, I've seen, the photography, I think, has been very limited sometimes, probably because of privacy issues, but as I pointed out, we don't have any problem when there's an Ebola outbreak in Africa, sending photographers into hospitals to take all sorts of photographs. There's also been a kind of more of a turn to human interest, but in a kind of sophisticated way. I think in particular that one story a few weeks ago about those two Chinese healthcare workers, one the doctor, one the nurse, who then you had a sense, if you know how to read, at the end of the day, one of them was not going to be alive. It was beautifully told. It was a great example of literary journalism working in terms of a newspaper. And I just wonder about what you think of the coverage so far, not to invite you to be critical of your colleagues, but what the kind of the sensitivities we've been having about how we report the crisis, whether in terms of photography or elsewhere.
Yeah, it's an important question. It's one we talk about a lot. There's a bunch of different strands there. One of them is just the sheer practicality of how do you cover this thing? All of us in the newsroom, a lot of people we all grew up, you go out, reporting means you go knock on doors, you go shoe leather reporting, you're walking the beat, you go drive where it happens. You can't do that now. So how do you get inside a town where the outbreak is reshaped things? How do you get inside a hospital where it's dangerous to go? It takes a new kind of reporting, and we're figuring that out in real time. We are sending people to places. We do have reporters out in the world. They are, checking in with, we've got medical professional advisors, and every trip is signed off on what's the plan, what kind of protective equipment do you have. We're saying no to a lot more trips than we would have before, but we are sending people out. But even more people are learning new ways of reporting. And how do you bring texture to a video call? How do you interview the friends of friends of friends of somebody by Skype. We're trying to figure that out, but it's been slow. And I think that, as you say, perhaps you're detecting less texture in some stories. Though I think we are figuring out, and the one you mentioned, I could point to a dozen more, to me do feel like they've got quite a lot of life in them. But to the privacy concerns, they're real, and hospitals are really hard to operate inside of because of HIPAA laws, and we've got reporters, videographers, photographers embedded in a number of hospitals where they have agreed to let us in, but we can't roam quite as freely as we would like. We're not publishing the names a lot of times of people who have been infected to protect their privacy, but we're telling lots of stories of people who, still would rather we didn't, whether it's, a super spreader party in New York City for somebody's 40th birthday, or a super spreader party at a biotech conference. We're not, I don't think, being overly deferential to that, but it is a sensitivity that we try to take seriously.
Yeah, no, I can see it's very hard to walk that line. I guess early on, my fears were that, for all of us isolated this way, the virus has such an abstract sort of manifestation. I'm here in Brooklyn. I hear sirens. Obviously, the streets are empty. I know one person who had the virus, a mild case, and was okay. But, other than that, I don't really see it. And I could imagine people who are less well inclined to believe science and statistics thinking, wait a second, I don't see anything going on around me. And which is why I was wondering about sort of some of the photographs, the kind of, that would bring home the reality, the kind of felt reality of it. Suketu is having problems getting back in. So he's posed some questions which I'm going to pose for him. The first one he asked was, he said, you've launched a live blog, the At Home series, a new podcast with Cheryl Strayed. These are a lot of the new projects in just a few weeks. How are they working out? Which I'd love you to speak some more about. He said also, what advice would you give journalists starting out now? What skills are the Times looking for? Is the Times looking for going forward?
Yeah. So this is to the success of these new products. By and large, they're really working. We're seeing a giant appetite for news right now. The Times made all of our coronavirus coverage free, and people are taking advantage of that. We've got people flocking to us in huge, huge numbers. So the audience and the appetite are big. This live coverage that I described, if you go to the homepage now, it's always on. We've got a live blog from New York City, one about the economy, one about the US, one about the world. So 4 different simultaneous live blogs. And we're seeing people are coming back multiple times a day, 5, 6 times a day to check what's new. They didn't do that when it was just a regular homepage, and they didn't do that when the news moved at a slower pace. So the investment in that live coverage seems to be worth it. We started a coronavirus briefing, a newsletter that goes out at 5 or 6 p.m. In case you're not following the live blog every minute, here's a snapshot of what happened today. And that's, already has millions of subscribers to it. It's already become appointment reading for a huge number of people. And audio too. The audio patterns are interesting. We were just talking, without a commute, without the gym, there's a lot less time people have for listening. Their routines are screwy. We're finding that people are making time for the daily in particular, but also the podcasts that we have that are kind of in the family of the daily are also finding audiences as well. So people are at home, people are obsessed with the story, and we're finding that the more ways we can tell it, the more ways people are consuming it. Mm-hmm. And sorry, the other question was?
The question was sort of, what do you, this is a question Suketu and I are dealing with. You have anxious students. Our students are fantastic.
Yeah.
And they're wondering what they can do to, what kind of skills a place like the Times, media in general, are looking for, and what kinds of things are going to be valued, and how has that changed because of this?
Yeah. I can speak in generally too, and how the pandemic is reshaping the reporting needs. It's so early that, I can kind of riff, but we don't quite know yet. In general, what we are the kinds of people that we're most excited about are reporters, medium agnostic, really. Like the people who you hear on the daily, the best audio reporters are the same ones who are breaking the big stories in print. We've really found that an audio reporter, a print reporter, a TV reporter, for us, it's people who have an expertise in something, but even more, they know how to find things out, right? They know how to develop that real fluency, whether it's, the internet. Kevin Roos is obsessed with the internet, how it's reshaping us, our communications, our society, our politics. And now the pandemic is really changing our relationship with the internet. And he's kind of following that story in real time in a way that for us means every medium, whether it's audio, newsletters, text, like I want to know what Kevin is seeing out there on the internet and what he thinks of it. And that is the kind of expertise I mean, where it's someone obsessed with their story, their patch of territory. So it's, Sarah Cliff is someone from Vox who we recently hired to cover healthcare. And she was obsessed with people's stories from the ER and how their ER bills had racked up. And she just poured herself into trying to understand how emergency rooms worked and who paid for them and why they cost so much. And that kind of obsession to us just shows a real passion, but also an ability to burrow inside a story and bring readers along.
Right.
So when I think of the readers, the reporters that we're hiring, it's those who have demonstrated they're able to really find out something new and explain it. It's not necessarily means that it's somebody who broke the next Watergate, though that's always great, but it's just somebody who's understands something complicated and has figured out how that world works and has figured out how to explain it. And whether they did it through a podcast, we've hired great podcast journalists, or they had a newsletter that they wrote every week, or they were writing newspaper stories. All of that is kind of beside the point, because if you're able to do that, tell that story powerfully, we're confident it'll work in whichever medium.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear, because NYU in general and literary reportage in particular really focuses on that, the idea not just of great writing, but really in-depth reporting and creative reporting, and
exactly.
that can find its way onto any platform, and that people like yourself are looking at all sorts of publications, looking for those elements, not necessarily looking for high profile. I don't know if you're looking at the questions.
I'm not. Should I be?
Yeah. If you maybe want to click on that, the Q&A part, and look at some of the questions. I'll read you one from Suketu also, that he says, you started out at the Staten Island Advance. Most local newspapers were left out of the stimulus payments. There are massive layoffs, closings, and salary cutbacks at media organizations all over the country, but people need the news. How will local journalism survive? Can you just solve that problem for us?
It's the biggest crisis, genuinely, I think it's one of the biggest crises in democracy, is the crumbling of local journalism across the country. I did start at the Staten Island Advance, and it was a great paper, and we covered every car accident and every community board meeting, every PTA meeting. You write a story, and then the next day you see the people that you wrote about at the meeting. They tell you what they thought about it. And it's a different kind of accountability that I learned a lot from, and I think is really important to community and to local government. And it's been in bad shape for a long time. And I really worry that the pandemic is going to be fatal or near fatal for a lot of these places. And no, I don't have a solution for it, and I'm deeply worried about it. The Times is trying to figure out ways to work on that. We've got partnerships with lots of local places that are doing ambitious work. We did one last year with the New Orleans Times-Picayune around climate change, and we've worked with Texas organizations around immigration. We've got other partnerships like that in mind, but we don't have any illusion that that's going to solve the crisis of not having reporters in every state house in the country anymore.
So another person has asked, so I guess the questions are coming both in the Q&A section, which is good, and also the webinar chat. So Hannah asks, because of the remote reporting that has now become the norm, local stories are basically difficult to report as international stories, difficult. how can we as budding journalists use this to our advantage and fill open spaces in the media coverage?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's absolutely right that foreign, local, national, it's all kind of collapsed into the same the same thing, which is a great opportunity. Um, to me, there is something happening in the universe that none of us have ever seen before. And so it demands that we figure out how to tell that story. And local, international, like I want to read all of it. Like I want to know how Brooklyn neighborhoods are being reshaped and new patterns are being formed. I want to know what the hell is going to happen when it hits refugee camps in places where there's no such thing as running water. I want to know what Indian mayors are doing in New Delhi and Bombay. Like I'm just curious about all of this, and I think that lots of people are too. So I would figure out a patch of territory and just try to understand how are they responding to it. And to your point, you can't get granular enough. You know, every nurse has a dramatic story, I promise. Every death, there's 700 people dying a day in New York City, just about. Every single one of those is a dramatic story. We just, almost by happenstance, a reporter yesterday talked to a 31-year-old woman who was living with her parents, and both of them died within 5 days.
Oh my God.
It's just hard to fathom that, and not this hasn't happened before. That's just one person. It's 2 deaths out of 700, but that's a really powerful story that we're going to tell. So I wouldn't spend too much time thinking about which stories or what or how or what. It's just like jump in.
Right. So report what you can from wherever you are.
Yeah, yeah. You know, we had a columnist write about the local bakery in Park Slope that she went to every day for years, and is one of our most read stories because the woman was trying to keep her bakery open and she was really struggling with it. And that was just Jen Senior missing her daily croissant. And
Right.
it turned into a really well-read story. So I think you can write as local as you can, and I think if you've got a question about, you know, New Delhi or Cincinnati or public schools in Kentucky, now actually you can go find it just as well as anybody else.
And where, I mean, for those who aren't Gen Senior, where do you suggest publishing these things? I know there've been, we at NYU have tried to encourage publications in Bedford and Bowery, which was actually a sub site that we started with the Times and then migrated over to New York Magazine, and something called Pavement, and there are a lot of other local places. Do you have any sort of just advice about where to pitch these kinds of stories?
You probably know this ecosystem better than I do. So I'm not sure I do. I mean, I've seen, you know, Slate is running, you know, coronavirus diaries, which are these great entries from all over different kinds of experiences. I think you're seeing just about every website, every publication you can think of is trying to figure out how to get purchase on this story. You have a better sense of who's buying, you know. But I'd also say, and you know, I think it sounds crazy perhaps, but you know, in some ways, like social media platforms are really powerful places for this. You know, they're not going to pay the rent, and that's a whole nother question. But you know, I think of your guest last week, Miss Fan from the New Yorker. She published this like really powerful tweet storm about this racist encounter that turned in, you know, it reached tons of people. And we covered it on the Daily with her, and she wrote about it elsewhere. But it started there, and that writing, as economical as it was visceral and grabbed people. And I think that those kinds of tweet storms, that kind of like reduction of experience into short sentences mixed with photographs, it's kind of a new form of storytelling, but it's one that's accessible to anyone. And now is a moment to experiment with it while acknowledging it sure won't pay the bills right now.
Right. So finally, something we can actually like about social media.
Yeah.
The it's instructive that you mentioned before we started that some of those tweets by Jian Fan you had seen, and then she made her way onto the Daily. So you know these forms of social media are being scanned and looked at. If they're being looked at by you, I'm sure they're being looked at by places like the Guardian and the Washington Post and everywhere else. So in a way, this might be a good opportunity to get your stuff seen, to sort of, in effect, pitch through social media. One question Suketu asked is, So will this accelerate the move away from print? Who's going to bring in a newspaper from the front stoop when it's been touched by so many hands?
It's a real question. We actually, it hasn't affected us dramatically yet. We have, in that we're not seeing print subscriptions go down meaningfully, but it's still early. And I think you're right. People are going to have less. They're going to want to touch fewer things. And the newspaper may be one of those. We do think that there's safe ways to handle the newspaper, but it's a big machine, the print newspaper. And, you know, we talked about our reporters' safety and keeping them safe. The people who work at the printing plants are the ones that we're really most worried about in some ways, because they have to go there every day. And there's a lot of machines, a lot of people in there. And we're doing what we can to protect them, and temperature checks and all of that. But the print paper is a thing that we're thinking about differently in the Corona era.
I mean, the revenue model is something that, you know, all journalists think about a lot. And I'd say when I first started in journalism, if you had told me that the New York Times would make more money from subscription than from advertising, I would have laughed at you. And everyone in mainstream media would have. I think it's a very healthy thing to actually try to derive your income from your readers, not from your advertisers primarily. How will, you know, there was a moment in 1969 where there was a huge newspaper strike, and a lot of publications emerged and made good of it. The Village Voice, all of a sudden, it was a non-union shop and was able to get real prominence because, you know, there was nothing else for news sellers to sell. The New York Review of Books was born. How do you see in the future being able to monetize the incredible excitement about news? I think one of the things that was disappointing about the so-called Trump bump was that it didn't seem to have an ability, publications an ability to really keep going with that. Do you see this as a different situation?
I think so. I mean, the lesson, the New York Times lesson, and the Times is its own machine with advantages that nobody else could have. But I think the lessons are instructive. And the big change you described was moving from an advertising-based model to a subscription-based model. And the mantra that we have is make journalism worth paying for. And if you do that, if you tell stories like the ones that you've mentioned, if you produce something like The Daily, as ambitious and excellent as it is, we think that people are going to pay for it. And that has been true. And it's actually, as you said, really clarifying. The stories that we are most excited about, the ambitious narratives, the big investigations, the voicey first-person accounts, those are the things that most resonate with our readers. So there's this like lovely connection there. If those big narratives were the things that nobody cared about, it'd be a different kind of conversation. But right now there's this great virtuous thing that when we do good work, more people want to read it and pay for it. And I think there's a lesson there for other places. Are you producing work that genuinely, if you're being honest, is worth paying for? Would you pay money for this? Is it different enough from everything else you can get out there for free? And if it's not, I think you're going to have a hard time figuring out how to survive in this era. But if it is distinct enough and that people want to pay for it, I think we've shown, and a handful of other places have too, that there is a path forward.
It does, however, as someone asked, it does somewhat change the definition of what is news, and that's been evolving. I mean, I think back to even where to Abe Rosenthal when he invented the various sections based on, as he says, Clay Felker's sort of invention of kind of a certain kind of lifestyle journalism, and all of a sudden you had living and cooking and all sorts of things. That was seen as a big innovation. Gabriel Serpa asks, he says, as you mentioned, people are needing a different kind of news. The shift means that cooking blogs, Pinterest, how-tos, at-home workouts are being considered serious journalism for what might be the first time ever. Do you think this shift will alter the nature of reporting itself, or at least redefine our value systems as readers and writers? What does it mean for the future of the journalist?
It's such an important question, and it's been one of the big changes that I've seen just in the past 5 years is this, the rise of service journalism, how to give yourself a haircut was one of the most popular stories. I bet not many people on this phone call aspire to write stories like how to give yourself a haircut, but it's really useful actually. And what we found is that a kind of service journalism is really meaningful and important. And what we're starting to see, like anything else, can be done well and can be done poorly. And we're trying to figure out what is high quality service journalism. And what it looks like is, Ron Lieber, who is a personal finance columnist in a previous era, would be writing, learned columns about how one should manage their pension account, say, but now is writing these kind of urgent, direct to the reader things. Here's how to apply for the federal loans. Here's how to teach your kids about saving for an allowance. And it's this really practical, textured, human to human, his expertise shared with you kind of journalism that I don't see as a lesser form of journalism at all. I think it's a modern form of financial journalism. And I think there's lessons there across just about every sector. Certainly in cooking, we've seen, Sam Sifton, who I mentioned before, is a brilliant journalist. He was a culture editor. He was the national editor. He's now the food editor, among other things. And What to Cook Tonight is his mission. And he's improving a lot of people's lives by guiding them towards that. And it's a different kind of journalism, but as you said, it's a modern version of the birth of lifestyle journalism that happened a generation ago. So we think that service stuff is real and it's important, and that done well, and we're still figuring out how to do it well, it can absolutely be a first tier kind of journalism that we're proud of and we think will be part of the landscape.
And that's sort of the key to it. I mean, I always feel very dull when I say things like, people talk about the journalism, the business model, and how is it going to survive? And I say things like, you've got to make it worth paying for. Service can be done, but it has to be done well. I mean, Adam Moss at New York Magazine took that to a very high level. It was some of the most stylish, best designed service. And I think you've seen in the Times and elsewhere really upping your game in terms of design and everything.
Yeah, just one more on that. I hope people on this phone call know the Wirecutter website. It's part of the Times. We acquired it a couple of years ago. And it felt in some ways so different from what the New York Times does. What vacuum cleaner should you buy was one of their most read stories, but it's so Timesian in that they are obsessed with vacuum cleaners, and they do all the reporting to find out which are the best ones, and they're going to, as clearly as they can, tell you. And that kind of reporting going into a totally new territory was for us like a revelation, and made all of us like fall in love with Wirecutter and the very kind of deep reporting that they do, and was a sign of like, wow, this is a different world now.
Yeah. Well, as a Wirecutter devotee, Suketu asked, he says, The Daily is one of the most successful podcasts on the planet. You've called it the front page of the New York Times. More than 2 million listeners download each episode compared to 443,000 who read the print edition of the weekday paper. How did you first conceive of it, and what makes it so successful?
Yeah, the Daily is a modern miracle, and I don't know if I can quite even diagnose what makes it work so well, but I'll try. It started, we didn't take podcasts particularly seriously at the Times. We had a podcast here, a podcast there. If you're a sports desk, you want to start a podcast, great, press record. I think the computer can press record and publish it, right? And then in the post-serial craze, we decided, what if we take audio seriously? They're doing great work. We can do that. And in the old-fashioned way, I think we would have said, hey, Metro editor, you're a good journalist. Now instead of Metro coverage, you're in charge of audio coverage. Go do that. Instead, we said, you know what? We need to find a person who knows things we don't know, an audio journalist, and have them help us figure out. We posted a billboard on the internet. We put out a page that said, what does the New York Times sound like? And we got it hundreds, thousands maybe of answers. But through that, we found an audio producer in Boston who worked for WBUR named Lisa Tobin, who had a quite compelling vision of what the New York Times should sound like. And we hired her. She was young. She was just one hire, but she had a notion. And she very quickly built a small team. And we very quickly started piloting a politics show with Michael Barbaro, who sat next to me in Metro he was like a fun reporter to talk to, kind of gossipy and wicked and smart as hell. And it felt like, yeah, I like talking to him. I bet he could be good on a podcast. And Lisa built this little crack team that saw a new way of of reporting the news. And I think their big insight was New York Times reporters know a lot of stuff, but the newspaper stories sometimes don't really take advantage of that. In the newspaper stories, all you write about is what happened yesterday. And what these New York Times reporters, they know everything that happened 20 years to get to that point. So why are you only asking about yesterday? This story starts 10 years ago. Let's hear the whole story. And the second insight was that it's not an amazingly revelatory one, but people like stories. Don't tell the news as a story. So the like classic reverse pyramid structure of you say the most important thing here and there, they said, no. Let's start at the beginning. And the way that I think about it, if a house burned down, a local newspaper, when I was at Staten Island Advance, we would write, a house burned down yesterday on Elm Street. The way the Daily would tell the story is they'd start, first a family moved into this neighborhood, and then they raised 2 kids in this house, and then they had this lovely life in the house, and then the house burned down, right? They build all this drama to it. And that has been kind of a revelation. You can build that drama into a Supreme Court case, into a healthcare decision, into all kinds of things. And so I think it's the dramatic storytelling, the expertise of the reporters, and the clarity of the production that have made it so mandatory. And we couldn't be more excited or ambitious about audio journalism.
Yeah, it's a fantastic development. Part of literary reporting that we've really emphasized over the years is audio. Most of our students take about half of their curriculum in audio and are ready to work in audio. Oh, cool. I joke about Friday, though, about when Michael Barbera has to list the names of everyone included. It now runs about the length of the entire audio podcast. Suketu asks, he says, excuse me, are you noticing a change in your readership since the coronavirus crisis started? And since the paywall was lifted from the sections of the paper, are there readers who are coming to the site during Trump's nightly press conferences to check whether drinking Lysol is a good way to fight the virus? Are you getting more global readers? So I guess about your readership.
Yes. And the answer is yes to everything. We're getting way more readers from everywhere, particularly internationally. We're seeing a lot of growth there. But I think it's the urgency of the story and the lack of the paywall has just kind of opened the floodgates. So for us, the trick is now, okay, we've got this singular moment where we have more people on our website than ever. How do we keep them there? How do we introduce them to the rest of the New York Times? How do we make them New York Times people now and not just kind of driving by for today's Trump press conference? And we're trying to really think hard about that because we think we've got a lot to offer them. So it's introducing them to the rest of the coverage, to the crossword puzzles, to the cooking, trying to get them to sign up for newsletters, trying to tell them about the Daily if they don't know about it, all of the other stuff that we're excited about. We think now is a real opportunity to tell our growing readers about it.
This is kind of a granular question, but maybe you can answer it. It says, regarding the remote production, how do you go about grabbing natural sound and ambient noise while maintaining social distancing? That's something you want to speak to?
Yeah, and it kind of changes on each story. I mean, we did one today on the Daily. Lindsay Garrison and Annie Brown produced it. That was a Zoom funeral, right? And our reporter, Catherine Porter, was there for the funeral and it was recorded. And so that ambient noise is, the dogs barking during the funeral at someone's home. So we're kind of adapting with the world and finding the ambient noise where it is. But we've also got reporters out in the world. Sherry Fink has been embedded in a Brooklyn hospital in Fort Greene for a long time now, and she's recording everything. And so we made a whole audio documentary based on that. But we're also, using the same found footage that we always do, whether it's, plucking from press conferences or from media events or recorded shows, or, the real textured sound is an important part of the Daily, and we're not letting that go.
Suketu asks, he says, what are the projects that media organizations other than the Times have launched recently that you like?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, The Atlantic has been doing great work during the pandemic, and they launched a big ambitious series now in audio again about Hurricane Katrina, which feels oddly resonant. They clearly been working on it a long time before the pandemic, but there are a lot of echoes that I think make it even more powerful. You know, Stat is a website that I didn't know very well before this, but they're doing really smart work about the virus. But even more, I keep reading stories about the search in big farm for the antidotes for cures for vaccines. I'm spending a lot of time in audio, so I'm really curious at all of the new audio projects that have popped up around coronavirus, and many of them are good. There's been a lot of urgent videos, and I know there's a lot of documentary films being made. I'm really eager to see which is like the one who captures the strangeness of this moment. I could go on and on, but I feel like it's been a really exciting creative boom for lots of different places in many different ways.
Are you at all, I mean, tempted to experiment with something like short form video, like TikTok or something like that?
We probably should be. You know, we report on TikTok a lot. We've got, you know, Taylor Lorenz is this incredible modern reporter who lives on social media platforms. She's got something like 16 different Instagram accounts so she can see what's being sent to her in different feeds. And she and a handful of others know TikTok way better than me. And we're doing great stories about it. Should we be publishing on it? Probably, but I don't know what the New York Times looks like on TikTok yet. And, you know, we take pretty seriously, like, we want to go to new platforms when we feel like we can do our best work and be ourselves in a way that matches that platform. So when Lisa came and built this audio department, we knew how to live within audio in a way that felt very true to us. I don't think we know how to do that on TikTok. And there's nothing more embarrassing than, you know, grandpa dancing around in leather pants. And we don't want to be like that on TikTok. So
maybe Quibi first, and then you work up to TikTok.
right.
Suketu also asked, are you doing any reporting projects of your own, and how do you deal with the logistical challenges of remote reporting?
Yeah, you know, I think of myself as a reporter. That's how I spent my career, and I don't get to do enough of it anymore, and not nearly as much as I like trying to do all of this other stuff. But I do try to have a reporting story going in the background. I had a couple before the pandemic, which now feel utterly irrelevant in a way that's kind of depressing because I was excited about those stories before. But yeah, I mean, now I'm trying to figure out how to contribute most meaningfully. And, you know, as an editor, I think the best thing you can do is give your best ideas to reporters and writers who are better than you and are able to really interrogate them. So I'm working with a bunch of reporters on stories. But I'm writing a lot of obituaries. I found that is a way, like this, no, I just can't get over 700 people dying in New York City every day. So we're trying to do as many of those obituaries as we can. And I found that, as you said, this pandemic can just feel like a big numbers game, a big chart. And these obits have been a really powerful way for me to like actually connect. So I wrote one recently, just short little ones, but they're still, for me, meaningful, about a Brooklyn guy, a lovely Brooklyn guy who was a real leading figure in Brooklyn's steel pan music scene. He was from Trinidad and had came here and founded a band and had been a mentor for generations of young Caribbean kids. And he was kind of inspiring in how much he loved this music. So I wrote about him, spoke to his family and his friends and his colleagues, and have been listening to a lot of steel pan music this week ever since.
It was one of the questions, and it does sort of get at something I wanted to sort of close with, was the question is, have you thought about the first story you'd like to cover immediately following the pandemic? Do you think the amount of post-corona coverage will be larger than pre-corona coverage? And I guess one of the questions I had is along those lines, which is, how long does this go on? I mean, you know, one of the things that I almost fell off my chair when your reporter McNeil was on the Daily. He said, you know, you do got to remember the mumps vaccine took 40 years, and that was the limit. I mean, this could go on a long time. And how do you? So I guess how do you keep these things up? But also, what is the horizon? What do you see over the horizon that you'd like to do? What are the stories that, quote unquote, day after?
I think this is going to last a really long time. You know, I love that essay on Medium, The Hammer and the Dance,
Yeah.
And the dance, the notion that, we've been through the hammer. It was, okay, everybody locked down, but that ends. And then the dance of how much do you come out, a little bit, who comes out? I think that's going to go on for a long time and going to be really complicated. And it's going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And, we don't understand the scope of this thing. Today's story, yesterday's story, that 1 in 5 New Yorkers had it. My wife is now thinking, oh, that day, maybe did I have it? Everybody's going through that. We don't understand this disease yet, which is to say it's going to go on a long time. And there's so much coverage to come out of it. To me, like the 3 stories that I keep thinking about that somebody's going to tell really well, and I hope it's us, the race for the vaccine. Inside, like, who are the scientists who are doing that work? What does it look like? Where are the laboratories that are ahead of the game? Like, you literally can't think of a higher stakes project, and somebody's going to crack it. And to think what it's like for them, their day-to-day life, their work, the dead ends they're hitting, how they're solving, like, it's just going to be a brilliant book by someone someday. That's one big one that we're trying to understand. Another one is inequality, and just how stark inequality feels right now. How some people, like me, frankly, are comfortable in their homes, able to do remote work, and other people are forced to ride the subways and deliver food and go to work at stores. And, inequality had been kind of a political slogan in America for a lot of people, and now it's life or death. And I think really understanding the stakes there is going to be one of the big stories. And then I think the third one is going to be this is my daughter, Stella.
Hey, Stella, how you doing?
I think the third one is going to be how to get rich in a pandemic. Who's profiteering now? When the oil prices went upside down the other day, like, somebody figured out how to make a fortune there. And, we did a story early on about a guy who was hoarding hand sanitizer, and the story went completely viral. Who's taking advantage of these federal new programs? Like, that story is going to go on even when we're all back at work. That will last, and that's, like, I'm hungry to read those stories.
Yeah. Well, one last question, actually, from an alum, Fariba. She says, "Greetings from Istanbul. A group of freelancers and I started On Spec, a news podcast about underserved communities in the global South. Slowly, it's gaining listeners, and our blog is bringing readers on Medium. We're interested in audience engagement and wondering what advice you might have about how to involve our audience in our work."
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And some of our best stories, particularly now in the pandemic, are coming from our audience. We launched a project, and I'd love whoever here to help contribute to it, that we're calling In Harm's Way, where we're saying, the heroes of the story, the protagonists of the story, are the medical workers, right? If we remember from 9/11, the firefighters, it's going to be the medical workers here. So we're trying to gather photos of medical workers. We're saying, tell your story, share your photo of yourself and tell us about your experience. And we're building a big gallery of those photos. But even more, we're harvesting them for stories. There's endless. Every single nurse has a story. And so I think that's a way to do it, is to, whether it's on Medium or in the podcast itself or starting a newsletter, wherever you think you can hang a shingle, probably all of those places, ask people to contribute and ask them a pointed question. Do you have a story about X? Share a photo from Y. Have you spoken to your father this week? What did you speak about? We're looking for these conversations. Like, whatever you want to know about. I think people are hungry to engage and tell their stories right now. And so if you ask in a bunch of different places, my guess is you're going to find people who are willing to share.
That was a very successful technique on that podcast, Note to Sell. Death, Sex, and Money, Death, Sex, and Money, where they would give prompts and ask people to call in and answer those prompts, and then riff on those and incorporate them into the podcast. It was a very intelligent form of engagement, I thought.
I think it's really hard to ask an open-ended question sometimes, but a pointed one can really spark conversation and can lead to larger conversations too.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you, Sam. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and being so forthcoming on these issues. And we really look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you for having me. It was very fun talking with you. And good luck, everyone. Please stay safe and write lots of stories.
Okay, and I hope you will tune in again next week, next Friday at noon. Amanda Ronchik of Planet Money is going to be
Oh,
speaking
great.
with our own Ellen Horn about exactly these issues. So
Very good.
have a good weekend. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
All right.